So we're going to ask, why did the Second World War break out? We'll begin by looking at some of the critical short-term factors leading up to the actual outbreak of war itself. We'll then have a look at some of the longer-term factors as well, and finish by looking at a couple of different interpretations of why the war broke out. So let's look first at some of the last trigger factors leading up to the outbreak of war itself. If you remember, back in the Munich Agreement in September of 1938, Chamberlain and Daladier had agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia as long as he promised not to make any further military invasions or wars to expand German territory. And Hitler had promised he wouldn't do that. Well, in March of 1939, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. At the time, Britain and France didn't declare war. This probably made Hitler more confident that they wouldn't declare war in future. Although at the time they were definitely building up their militaries and did expect a war to take place. Chamberlain did realise that appeasement had failed. He understood now that Hitler was not a man that you could make deals with, was not a person to be trusted, not a person who would keep his promises. So he realised that appeasement has failed. Hitler now starts to look towards Poland and Danzig. He demands Danzig should be returned to Germany. If you remember back from the Treaty of Versailles, it had been made an independent port run by the League of Nations, and Hitler is demanding that Danzig and parts of the Polish corridor should be returned to Germany. Very critical now. In March, after the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, Britain and France, they make a definite support of Poland in war. They say, look, this is it. We will definitely go to war in support of Poland if Hitler invades. Chamberlain has definitely realised in March of 1939 that he cannot trust the Nazi leaders again, and so the declaration of support for Poland is a very firm one. There is really a sea change. There's a big change in the attitude of Britain and France towards the expansion of Germany. They have changed away from the policy of appeasement to being definitely and firmly ready for war. Britain has started to see Hitler as a real threat, an eventual threat to the British Empire if he keeps on expanding. And France definitely feels very threatened now and feels that only a war, only military means will stop Hitler from taking over Europe and France itself. They are definitely now more firm and more ready for war. Hitler has made something of a mistake though, because he doesn't realise how strong the determination of Britain and France is now. He has been perhaps misled by the policy of appeasement. On the 23rd of August, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed. This made Hitler confident that Britain and France wouldn't risk war because they couldn't count on the support of the Soviets. He thought without Soviet support, Britain and France wouldn't risk war over, for example, Poland, which Hitler had his eye on at the time. Something that made Britain and France more confident, though, was back in 1939, Italy and Japan refused to join Hitler if he did get into a war, an invasion of Poland. You may be aware, obviously, that they joined Germany later in the war in the Axis Pact, but that's not for a couple more years yet. At this stage, Italy and Japan have refused to join Hitler. That makes Britain and France a bit more confident. They're also not as worried about Soviet support as Hitler thinks, because Britain and France, they don't really have much respect anyway for the Soviet army. They didn't think it would be much of a big factor in war anyway. So although Hitler thinks the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, because it takes the Soviets out of the war, Britain and France won't risk a war, well, they're not that worried about Soviet support. They don't think the Soviet army is that important a factor anyway. Something that encourages Britain a lot is that after the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Dominions change and they now say they would support Britain. Again, this makes Britain feel more confident. It's got the support of the Dominions if there is a future conflict. Hitler, though, doesn't understand how determined Britain and France are now, and he thinks they are bluffing. So, when, on the 1st of September, Germany did invade Poland in a lightning blitzkrieg attack, and then when Britain and France did declare war on Germany, Hitler was absolutely surprised. He didn't think that they would risk going to war. These are his actual words. Why do they fight over Poland? He doesn't realise that they are now determined to stop his military expansion. So he's somewhat surprised. Let's look now at a range of long, medium and short-term causes of the Second World War. Well, right back in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was a significant factor. It left many in Germany feeling that Germany had been unfairly treated. It was unfair to blame Germany for the war, unfair to remove German speakers outside the German Reich, and the reparations were unfair. So a lot of resentments left over from the Treaty of Versailles. The failure of the League of Nations as an international peacekeeping body. If you remember, it failed to stop Italian aggression in Abyssinia. It had previously failed to stop Japanese expansion in Manchuria. When the League met up with big and powerful countries, it seemed powerless to stop their expansion. This also is a factor, the imperialism of Britain, France and Japan. Now, Japan obviously undertook aggressive military expansion throughout the 1930s. It invaded Manchuria in 1931 and it invaded China in 1937 in a particularly brutal military campaign. However, Britain and France can also be criticised as they did have large foreign empires at the time, and it's difficult for them to take the moral high ground and criticise Japan for expanding an Asian empire when they in fact have empires of their own. So yes, Japan, an aggressive and brutal imperial expansion, but Britain and France are not above criticism in the imperialism front. The Depression of the 1930s was a very significant factor. It increased the isolationism of the USA. It wasn't going to get involved in a war in Europe. That made the dictatorships more confident. It increased support for extremist parties such as the Nazis, which came to power in Germany in 1933. Hitler obviously was the leader of that party, and his policies played a part. Disarmament and weakness in Britain, France and the United States, as they didn't focus spending on the military in the early 1930s, but focused on dealing with the Depression. And of course, the Depression weakening the League of Nations as well, as the major powers don't want to impose economic sanctions for fear it's going to damage themselves. Appeasement of 1936 to 1938. Some people argue that it made Hitler more bold and more willing to take chances. There are other arguments, though, you will see with appeasement. In March of 1939, perhaps a very critical factor, the British and French declare they will definitely support Poland in the case of war, and it's that factor which kicks off World War I when Hitler does invade Poland. And what made Hitler confident enough to invade Poland? The Nazi-Soviet pact with Stalin, where he feels confident he's not going to have to fight Russia, and he feels that Britain and France won't fight without the support of the Soviets. Okay, so a number of long and short-term causes there of World War II. Quite often, you'll get an exam question in the GCSE exam, and it will say something like the Depression of the 1930s, or it will take any one of these factors and say, that was the main factor in causing World War II. How much do you agree with this statement? Well, if you get that sort of question, you need to talk about all of the factors and then end up by saying, look, which one do you think was most significant, and then how much you agree with, with the fact that was said. So if it says something like the Treaty of Versailles was the main factor, explain how much you agree and disagree with that by talking about all of the causes of World War II. Let's finish by looking at a couple of interpretations by famous historians of the Second World War. Let's begin with AJP Taylor. Now, his argument is that Hitler was a gambler, that he didn't have an intentional plan to do all of the things he did bit by bit. He kind of made it up as he went along. And when he did something and it went well for him, such as, for example, the whole Munich crisis, that encouraged him to take more chances. So he's arguing Hitler, a gambler, no intentional plan. He points out that Hitler's policies of trying to reverse the Treaty of Versailles were similar to earlier policies, for example, under Gustav Stresemann in the Weimar Republic. He points out that many Germans were also anti-Semitic. The world of the 1930s was probably more racist, you could argue, than nowadays. Nowadays, which I think is very right, it's unacceptable to publish racist rants and dialogues in newspapers or propaganda. You can't do that nowadays, which I think is a good thing, but you could get away with it then. So more people were anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish and supported Hitler. The argument that AJP Taylor is making goes along with that gambling thing, that according to AJP Taylor, he said that Hitler hoped to gain territories by threatening world war, but he didn't actually want a war. He hoped that by waving the stick, the threat of war, he'd get territories, but he didn't expect to actually have to get involved in a world war. That means, of course, that the war then was an unfortunate and terrible accident, that, it's based on the idea that, Hitler didn't expect Britain and France to go to war. And the argument there then is that as well as Hitler's policies, clearly Hitler's policies are a factor in the cause of World War II. He says that appeasement was also a very significant factor because appeasement encouraged Hitler the gambler. So all of the little bits that Britain and France gave Hitler when they gave in to him over the Rhineland, over Anschluss, over Munich and Czechoslovakia, each of those things encouraged Hitler to gamble and take more chances. So he really does blame appeasement as a major factor alongside Hitler in causing World War II. Well, that's one interpretation. Let's have a look at another one. This is from another one from a guy called Alan Bullock. Now, he argues, no, Hitler wasn't a gambler. Hitler was consistent. If you go back and read Mein Kampf that was written right back in 1923, he talks back then about a German empire in Eastern Europe. And there's no way that he could achieve that Eastern Empire without war. So Hitler all along knew that he'd have to go to war to achieve his ultimate ambitions. He also argues that, yeah, you're saying that, well, that AJP Taylor was saying that basically Hitler just wanted the same things as other politicians, but there was no other German leader who would dare like Hitler. Hitler was an unusual politician that was daring to risk war and was prepared to openly lie and take huge risks. So a different interpretation of the whole risk thing. One interpretation, Taylor is saying that he's gambling. Another, Alan Bullock, is saying, no, ultimately he is prepared to take risks, but he did want an empire and he knew that would lead to war in the end. And so according to Alan Bullock's interpretation, Hitler is largely responsible for the Second World War due to the fact he wanted to carve out his Eastern Empire. He couldn't get that without war ultimately anyway. So I hope you've made some notes there and come to some sort of idea which you think are some of the most significant factors in causing the Second World War.